All right, what's going on, everybody? So I am joined today by the lovely Daisy. Hi,
Hi
Daisy.
guys, how you doing?
And we are here to discuss some Gilmore Girls. So, Daisy, you were just bringing up a really, really good point about how we really don't hear a lot of like people talking about Gilmore Girls in certain spaces, things like that. So, what do you kind of think maybe a reason why a lot of people are more isolated with their Gilmore Girls discussion and it's not more mainstream?
I think part of it has to do with its age. Like it was really present largely before social media as we know it, right? Like there was MySpace, but you didn't have Facebook, you didn't have TikTok, you didn't have these things.
Hmm.
So when we were talking about these shows, it was through magazines. It was through ET, if anyone remembers ET, you know.
Yes.
It was through, your girls, that you watch it with. It was what would have been standard socialization for its time,
Yeah.
right? Before we had the ability to constantly be on our phones. And I think that's part of the beauty of Gilmore Girls is not only was it a product of its time, but it still remains so.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so when we talk about it now, a lot of times like in like I said the small corners of the internet where you see it goes into a deep dive of the relationships within Gilmore Girls or whose favorite character, the very base kind of discussions.
Yeah.
I love going into those deep dives though of the familial relationships, what you can learn from watching this family grow.
Right. That's my favorite part of it as well. And I always think about the fact that like Gilmore Girls was parodied by Mad TV, which I know sounds so crazy, but it's like Mad
That's how
TV.
big it was at the time.
Exactly. That's how big it was, but then it almost feels like it was just small enough to where it couldn't quite make the SNL skits. You know what I mean? But I don't know if it
Yeah,
actually did. I don't know if
yeah,
it
it
actually
was
did, but go
the
ahead.
closest I can come to like a comparison is calling it like a cult classic, even though it's not necessarily like a movie.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do
But it
think,
was
no, go ahead, go ahead.
because like it had a much bigger following than say Firefly,
Hmm.
which is definitely a cult classic at the time. Nobody really watched it, partially because of how it aired, but that's a discussion for when we talk about Firefly.
Which
Um,
I've never seen, so that's gonna be a little harder.
Understood. No,
But I'm here for it.
it was a sci-fi thing. So, but anyway, like it was, or like Stargate was a cult classic. Very few people watched it, very people watch it still, but it's still like wildly popular among its group.
Hmm.
This had a large amount of popularity, but when it left the air, when it left its time period, it that's when it stopped.
Yeah,
And so you kind of see that in like the modern, like how we talk about it in modernity, I guess is the best way to put it.
yeah. Gilmore Girls has definitely been one of those shows where people ask me, "You watch that too?" Which is so interesting because I feel like, okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. I didn't think that Charmed was a you watch that too kind of show until I started talking about it and people would say that to me and I was like, "Oh,
Really?
like yeah, yeah." Because and to me it was always, a huge thing. But I would meet people and I'd kind of bring it up and they'd be like, "What is that?" And but that was kind of a regular occurrence. But then as I started getting older and kind of like away from, the population I grew up with, I met more people who would be like, "Oh, I used to love that show." And
Yep.
some will be casual, and it'll be, about Charmed, and it would be like casual viewer to like me, expert level viewer. But Gilmore Girls is one of those that I feel like I still get a lot of you watch that twos, but it's much more. I remember watching it, but not kind of
Yeah.
like
Well,
it's
because
those
it
type of.
was, I feel like it fell into that time period where there was a sitcom for everything,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't necessarily prime time. It was meant for like families to watch together,
Yeah.
usually after dinner. You know, it was just after that prime time slot. So a lot of us did watch it and a lot of us talked about it, but I don't think it was like ER by any means, where, you know,
Right.
anyone in that time period, like you can point to anyone who grew up in the 90s and they've probably at least seen a episode
Mm-hmm.
of ER, or
Mm-hmm.
they know what you're talking about. With Gilmore Girls, yeah, they'll know the show you're talking about, but they may or may not have ever watched it.
Right, right. And Gilmore Girls to me seems much more in the class of like Seventh Heaven.
Yeah,
And not just because it's a WB show, but kind of that nostalgic feel where you're scrolling on Netflix and you go, "Oh my God, they have this show." You
yeah,
know,
yeah.
it feels a lot more like that than anything
It's
else.
like just above a CW.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that is exactly it. And did they made it to one season on the CW, right? Or did they make that cut? Yeah, because
So I know they were on WB and ABC Family. I don't know about the CW, but I also, the time slots I watched, CW were very particular because there were shows I wanted to see.
I feel like they had to have been CW because Charmed ended in 2006 and they missed that CW transition by the end of that season and because the
Oh
next year
goodness, I'm
started
curious.
CW. So I think Gilmore Girls was a CW show technically. It
Yeah, they
got
had
an
too
ending.
much funding to be like a traditional CW show, but I could
Yeah.
see them having access to it.
Well, what's interesting is when you think about kind of like the beginnings of the CW, that transition period from
They became a CW
yes,
show.
they became. So they started as a
You're
W
going,
because they started in like 2000. And then but they ended on the CW. Because
yeah,
like
okay.
because shows like that, Smallville, had not
Kyle XY.
Kyle XY, things like that. Those shows became see like the shows that came from UPN were like Girlfriends, One on One, all of us. Those shows came from there, and so all of them became this like new network. And I think once they realized like we don't know what we fully want this to be, they kind of let all the old stuff die off from the WB and
Hmm.
from UPN. And now we're in teeny bop, sort of country, but that's not necessarily what it started as.
Yeah, which is wild because like I recently did like a full rewatch of Gilmore Girls, and the place they ended on, I feel like had much more adult
Yes,
implications.
yes,
So for the
absolutely.
CW to be handling that, that's interesting. I kind of like that. But
See, and it makes me wonder what their initial kind of goal for the channel was, because
I heard it was soap operas.
that would have been very interesting. I almost feel like if they had decided to do that, Gilmore Girls would have been a perfect transition to go into that.
And that might have been the intention.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that now that like I'm thinking about that, because the CW, and the only reason I know this is gonna make me sound so old because I still listen to radio, like the radio in the car. And
Oh,
there was
okay.
a radio show talking about it, and they were like, so we looked into the CW because we were confused on what their whole gimmick was, because you know Supernatural had run for so long,
Mm-hmm.
and they looked at the age groups that they appealed to demographic wise, and it wasn't teens. It was older white women during the daytime.
I can
Soap
believe it.
operas.
That is so interesting. That's so because but you want to know what's interesting about this discussion is that we were there for that transition period, but we weren't old enough to, I
To
think,
comprehend it.
perceive and comprehend. Yeah, like it's something so foreign to us, and because I just remember one day them
Because in
being like, "All right, get up and give me
2007,
some."
I would have been 12.
I was 16.
Hey, okay. So you're my brother's age.
Yes, I'll be 34 this year.
Good for you, my guy.
Yes, I made it out of the trenches. Um
Yeah.
but no, I remember that time period, and I remember being sad that Charmed was not going on to the CW and being really excited for whatever the CW was going to become. And just I don't remember. I remember watching it. I just don't remember how I felt about it because that was what 18 years ago at this point.
Yeah. And so it's easy because, like, you don't remember everything that was going on then. And especially because, like, Gilmore Girls was right in my demographic. I was a 12-year-old girl
Hmm.
watching a young Rory Gilmore grow up in Hartford, Connecticut,
Hmm.
and try and figure out her life and be
Hmm.
pressed about college and wanting to do her best. And she
Hmm.
wanted to go to Harvard,
Hmm.
and I wanted to go to Stanford.
Hmm. And see,
And
okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh, I was going to say, so go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was so gung ho about it. I wanted to go to Stanford. I wanted to be a writer, and I
Mhm.
was gonna do it. I did not have the grades for that. I was precocious, but I
Yeah.
couldn't turn a paper to save my life. That was never gonna happen. But I saw myself in Rory, and so I was invested.
This is gonna sound so strange. Even though I was a teenager, right? And I was about Rory's age, I felt much more related to Lorelai. I always felt like Lorelai and I had some sort of like a kindred spirit aspect to us. And
But
if you
Lorelai
ask
was
me
so cool.
yeah, like, yes, Lorelai was so cool. And I remember thinking, like, I want to have a kid. Not right then. I didn't want to have one right then. But I was like, I want to be a mom, I mean, a dad one day. I want to be, I want to be like the cool dad, whatever. And I just loved Lorelai because I always felt like she went through so many things, but she always kind of like quote unquote came out on top. And now as an adult, I'm realizing the toxicity that was Lorelai Gilmore, yeah, I think is what attracted me. I
Yeah,
Because
because I mean, you're
Lorelai is very
16.
chaotic.
Well, and the thing about Lorelai, watching in a perspective now, this was a woman very much on the spectrum
Yes.
with no treatment,
Yeah.
trying to raise a child single-handedly
Hmm.
and go through life, especially with a complicated relationship with her mother. Like, she's just me without if I had a kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I handle Lorelai with a lot of kid gloves because that's hard.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
so hard. And I think maybe I treat it with too much empathy because she is just a TV character. But I have that tendency with all these characters because they are so well fleshed out.
Very. Even
You
Roy.
can see the details of their lives. You can make inference, you know?
Hmm. I remember I watched the video and it completely changed my perspective on the show because it was basically talking about how they were portrayed as these, kind of like not poor, but not having a lot of money and having to make it work people. But then you think about the fact that they have access to like this large amount of wealth that the worst Lorelai kind of has to do is go to Friday night dinners. And I was like, oh, because
Yeah.
when you watch it, they make Lorelai seem like everything is such an adventure, and her and Rory's life has just been so fun, and it's been this and it's been that. But then you kind of look at it, and I don't necessarily agree with this statement, but I can see where it could be perceived as Lorelai almost cosplaying as poor.
Yeah. And so, and I've heard that argument a few times, and I agree and disagree. I'm kind of like where
Yeah.
you are with it,
Yeah.
because at one point, she is very much trying to distance herself from the environment that she was raised in. She's
Hmm.
trying to raise a well-rounded daughter, and she's like, we're gonna do this on our own. But she does always have that open door,
Yes.
right, where
Yes.
she knows if she's truly struggling, she
Hmm.
can put on her big girl panties and deal with her mama.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
And a lot of us never had, will never have that opportunity, but would be nice,
I know.
Oh God. And to a certain degree, I have as well. Like, I came back home to go back to college, and not a lot of people have that opportunity at all. And I recognize that. That is a privilege.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't know. I don't know if I would count it as cosplaying as poor, but I would definitely see it as you know, those people who are like, I worked hard for everything I've earned in my life. And I'm like, but eh.
Have you?
But with Lorelai, you can see her working hard. You can see her trying. And
Mhm.
so I feel she was raised in privilege and she separated herself from it. I feel like it's almost like a different perspective. Um, and I can see that in people who have like they were raised in wealth, but their family lost that wealth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's almost that same kind of concept of they know what it's like, but they're
Hmm.
not experiencing it now.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's like when you watch Lorelai, okay, here was always kind of my thing with Lorelai. As I started getting older and watching it, I almost feel that my darling didn't quite know how to move in life if she wasn't upset with Emily.
Hmm.
And the reason that that strikes such a chord with me is, I think I've shared that I have a bad relationship with my grandmother. It, among other things, that's not even really the anyway.
Yeah.
Almost feel, but now that I'm older, I feel such a I relate to that so heavily because when you go through something and you're constantly it becomes your identity without you realizing it. And so it's almost like
Yeah.
if I heal that part of myself, then who am I? Where like starting over is scary, but it's like how would I deal with not being able to say like, oh well, this happened when I was younger or that or da 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 da. How would I, even though I
Hmm.
don't feel like I use it as an excuse anymore, I feel like I used to, but I don't now. I feel like the fact that I
I'm
still
kind of
say
in that
it,
same boat.
yeah, it's like how do you and that's why I have a lot of grace for Lorelai because Emily is such a huge part of her life, and I feel like she's constantly, subconsciously or out loud, trying to make Emily proud of her, but she also knows that she never will be proud of her. But then she kind
Yep.
of hopes that maybe she will. And Emily is
Absolutely.
constantly trying to be proud of Lorelai, but it's like she just can't make herself proud of her. So they have this very strange
Yeah.
take from each other.
And this is where I come in because Lorelai and Emily's relationship is so similar to me and my mother's.
Mm.
Maybe not with the wealth.
Hmm.
And I say that because my family was pretty middle class and then the '08 recession hit and we were lower middle class and we've kind of stayed there
Right.
for, the rest of our foreseeable lives.
Hmm.
But with me, I think Gilmore Girls helped me realize this too. It's not that Lorelai isn't proud or Emily isn't proud of Lorelai. She is. She just doesn't know how to express it
Yeah,
properly.
there you go. That's exactly it. That's exactly
They
it.
have two very different forms of communication,
Very.
and that's where the heads butt. And we also didn't see the full picture of how Lorelai was raised.
That is very true. We get little snippets. One of my favorite episodes is when we see Lorelai give birth because I love moments where you can see how similar Lorelai is to both of her parents, but specifically Emily, because the
Mm-hmm.
line that always sticks out for me from that entire episode, the entire episode, is when they're talking about the Lorelai and Chris, and they're like, "Oh, and Chris is so young," and Emily just goes, "It's not exactly like Lorelai is drawing Social Security," and I just thought that is such a Lorelai thing to say, to
Oh, I
take
know.
that moment
Emily
and
is
like
so witty.
she is.
She's
She is
so
so
funny.
witty. And when you hear that, you can tell Lorelai is clear because Richard is too. Like, don't get me wrong. And that's like you can tell in moments like that. I'm telling you, that
Like
is my favorite
sarcasm is a
moment.
language, and that family has perfected it.
Exactly. And I almost feel like because they speak to each other in sarcasm, it comes from such a different place, they don't know how to perceive it when the other one says it.
Yup.
Emily doesn't
Yup.
get Lorelai. Lorelai doesn't get Emily because Emily. Oh my God.
Neither one of them get Richard.
No, nobody. Yeah, Richard's just out there in the world. And one of my, but I think it's because he's like you said, he's so witty, but it's very far and few in between. He's a man
Yep.
with so few
And
words that when it comes out, it's like, oh, wait, what?
it's like a shock thing. Like, did you just make a joke? And it's the same thing with Rory.
Yeah. Oh God.
That's why they are so close, is because Rory is basically just Richard.
That's it. That's it. Female
And
form.
I love both of them so much. And I know a lot of people don't like Rory, and I can see why they wouldn't.
Let me tell you where I'm at with Rory. This is where I'm at as I genuinely think A Year in Life ruined her for me.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
if it hadn't been for that, I think I always had this place in my mind that Rory was just young. And so she was young. She very quickly got access to money that she had never had before, but that she knew she had access to, but not really. Like she knew it was part of her family, but she didn't know what it felt like to be able to use it. So I kind of always chalked it up to that. Then we get to A Year in the Life, and it's just like, this is what happens when you go unchecked.
Yeah, I can see that. And I had that stance at first as well. And then I stood back and I looked at all of the characters,
Hmm.
and almost none of them had any real character growth in the last time you saw them. And I
Hmm.
realized they did this right because they knew they kind of had to with this. The writing team chose not to show them who they would be as actual adults 20 years in the future because the fandom would hate it.
They would. They absolutely would. That's why I tell people all the time, you don't want to see a Charmed reboot. You want more seasons of the original show that you watched. And I'm bringing that up in this moment because I think A Year in the Life was one of those things that we didn't need, um, because we didn't want to see Rory be a hard-hitting journalist. We either wanted to see that or we wanted to see her journey to becoming the hard-hitting journalist, even though it had been over a decade at that point, or well, almost a decade at that point. And so for me, I feel like Rory is this is where I do give her grace though. Because even though I feel
Yeah.
like her choices are her choices, I give her grace in the fact that I love everyone down, but Rory is the result of everyone else, including Lorelai. And
Oh yeah.
so in that
She is spoiled
regard,
rotten.
very. And the thing is, like, you would think, oh, spoiling started with Emily and Richard, but it didn't.
It started with the town.
It started with the town. It started with exactly because I mean they held her to such a high standard. They put her on such a huge pedestal, and that's a lot of pressure for anybody to try to live up to. Like you literally
Oh
could
yeah.
not live up to the person that they painted Rory out to be. You can't.
Oh yeah.
She's just not perfect.
And she's a perfect little angel who can do no wrong. And
Hmm.
where I think they kind of stepped away from that a little bit is her affair.
Hmm. Hmm.
She
With
had that
Dean or
affair
with Dean? Okay, because I was
with
trying to
Dean
say
when he
which
was
affair.
married very briefly, married very briefly to another girl they went to high school with, and who was a friend of Rory's growing up.
Hmm.
And they are young and they have the affair, and Lorelai finds out, and for the first time you see a very real reaction to a very adult situation.
Yes,
And Lorelai handled it well.
she did. She
She
did.
did. No, I would have like, if that had been me and my parents, it would have been very different.
Hmm.
You know what I mean?
Hmm.
But she handled that well. She's like, no, this is your pile. You made it. You get to deal with it until it gets to a point where like she feasibly as like a teenager can. And Lorelai has to step in and be like, okay, these are still just kids.
Yeah. Yes. Because the thing is when you think about like Lorelai being the adult in a lot of situations, you think about just how young she actually is still. Like even
Because
though
she's only 16 years older.
she is, and it's like yes, she's in her 30s, but Lorelai is so childlike sort of in the way that she approaches life.
Oh, exactly. Could you imagine raising, because you're going to be 34, so Rory would have been about the same age for you as
Hmm.
she was then, about 18, 19 years old.
Hmm. I couldn't
Now
imagine.
imagine how you handle that
Wait.
situation.
There's if you told me right now that I was gonna there are people that I went to school with, high school with, and they have kids going to high school. Some of them have kids graduating high school. And
Mm-hmm.
all I can think is I went to school with someone that's a grandmother now. And
Yeah.
all I can think is if you told me that I had a 3-year-old, there would be no way. But to tell me right now at 34 that I have a 19-year-old or an 18-year-old that is going out into the world, I am just as immature as I want to be. And there is no way that I would be able to
Yeah.
handle something like that.
Yeah. Like I'm just getting to a point where I've seen a thing or two. I kind of know a thing or two. So when something goes wrong, I I can generally kind of work my way out of it, but I'm only just now getting there at 29.
Yes.
I couldn't imagine having a child and having to do that too, and having
Hmm.
to live like, you know, raise a child and figure myself out and get my shit together and have, a career. She had a career at this point.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's hard because like you said, I do think that Lorelai handles things well. But I think that sometimes she has to fight against the fact that she's raised Rory kind of like a sister almost.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and so when big things go down, she has to say out. I've noticed sometimes when I rewatch it, which I don't rewatch it in order. I just kind of watch as I want to watch.
yeah.
Um, but I noticed that Lorelai will say a lot, "I'm the mom, you're the kid,"
Because
and
she
I
almost has
think
to remind the both of them.
yes, and I think that's why she verbally has to give herself that prompt to be like, hey, 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 let's calm down.
Hold on, mom mode.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, we have fun, we eat our ice cream and drink our coffee, but at the end of the day, I am the parent. And because Rory will, like, she'll snap at even in the
She
early
does.
seasons.
And like with that same like series in the season of her going through and learning from the affair and stuff, and Lorelai pretty much for the first time ever putting a real foot down, real authority, real conviction. Lor- Rory moves out.
Yeah.
She
Oh,
goes, I'm going to grandma's.
I, Daisy Lou, let me tell you something. As an adult, that breaks my heart because I could not imagine. This is what makes me sad about it. Is thinking of all the times that Lorelai must have talked to Rory about like how bad it was for her growing up, why she didn't like it, why X, Y, and Z, and then for Rory to turn to them and move in with them. I just that always breaks my heart.
Oh,
I
I
know it shouldn't, but
know.
I just
And then on top of it, Lorelai is also being forced into like the empathy phase of this is how my mom felt.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. 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 And
It's there's so much to unpack.
it's such a big situation. And I always feel like Lorelai has to probably I say probably because I don't know what she's thinking, but I always felt like Lorelai was having to make herself not see it as a personal attack. And not see
Yeah,
because how could you not? I mean, the first thing that would come to my mind was she did this on purpose. That would be the first
yeah.
thing that I would think.
Hmm.
She moved in on purpose.
Especially because I watched this fairly recently, so I remember this fairly well.
Mhm.
Lorelai goes to them and goes, I'm going to have to put a severe foot down
Yes.
with my daughter, and I need you
Yes.
to back me up.
And for them to
And
act
they
like they didn't
don't.
remember, that was the thing, was them being like, well, we didn't talk about that.
Hmm.
That's always the part that gets me about it is,
And it's that same whiplash of having the empathy for Emily, but also remembering every reason why you left.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I think
Um,
it's the first brush you get of real empathy for Lorelai too, of seeing the betrayal of her family and those real feelings of like, I needed you.
yes, yes. And you know what? I'm glad you said that because I do think that to a certain extent, um, the reason that I think it could be very easy to say, because I've seen people say before that Lorelai overreacts to Emily, and I don't agree with that in any shape, form, or fashion. The only reason I think I can piece together why someone would think that is because we don't get a lot of, I think until really the later seasons, we don't really get a lot of solid examples of how it is to be Emily's daughter. And you
Exactly.
kind of
You get
touched
to
on that
see
earlier.
Emily as a grandmother, and that's a
Yes.
very different beast.
Yes, and we get a chance to see her, with Lorelai as an adult and how things are, but they never really give us we see Emily running after her as she's giving birth and screaming, things like that. And we see how hurt Emily was when Lorelai left and whatever else, and we hear about it, how hurt Emily was, but we never really get big examples, and I think that's because Lorelai keeps herself so separate from them. And now
Mm-hmm.
that Rory's an adult and she can kind of have more of an independent relationship with her parents, we really get a chance to see how Emily operates. Like we even see Lorelai getting closer to Richard and asking him for help with things
Mm-hmm.
and whatever else, and Emily being jealous of that. And it's like it's
Yeah.
not, even the fact that she would act like that. And I think the one of the biggest examples is at when she brings in Christopher trying to break up Lorelai and Luke.
Oh my God,
That
yes. No,
thing
the
did
like
to me.
angry tears every time that season comes up because like Emily, you had an opportunity
Yep,
to be so much better of a mother than you were,
yep.
and you just threw it away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You had the opportunity to be real and be like, you know what? It wasn't my choice, but this is, who she wants to be with. I can see she's happy.
Mm-hmm.
And there's moments in previous seasons where you can see Emily kind of approves.
Yeah. Yeah. She
She's
likes
like,
Luke.
"So are y'all getting serious? Like, is that what's happening right now?"
I almost wonder if that's like her trying to be like, okay, I guess I'll play her little game. And then she thinks that once they're in a much better place, she's like, okay, me and my daughter are cool. So now she's not gonna mind if I do this.
If I meddle. And that's
Mm-hmm.
like the whole point is you stop meddling. That's why the relate like your guys' relationship improved.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows you just how little Emily actually learns.
Yes. Yes. Because, in the same way that we're talking about Lorelai not really being mature enough to truly be a parent. I mean, all jokes aside, like she's really not mature enough, but she is. She just is. I kind of feel the same way for Emily. I feel like maybe Emily wasn't ready for all of that, but just
Oh,
told herself she had to
absolutely.
get ready. Like I have a
Exactly.
daughter now, and then like they even have a discussion one time, and she's like, that's not how mothers and daughters talked when I grew up. Like how y'all are, and she just asked her point blank, and that's another one of my favorite scenes. She just asked her point blank, "Why can't we be like you and Rory?" And Lorelai was kind of looking at her like, "Oh, okay, wasn't expecting this today."
You
Um,
want to have this conversation? Okay, let's go.
exactly.
Um, because that was never on the table for them
Mm-mm. No,
ever,
no.
ever, 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 because it's too scary.
Yes, yes. Emily doesn't know
And
how to be
I know that
her
feeling
daughter. Hmm.
because if my mother looked at me and said, "Why don't you tell me?" or "Well, why don't we communicate better?" You know,
Mm-hmm.
and just point blank sat there and I had to sit there and lay it out.
Yeah,
Absolutely not.
yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Because like I love my mother down. She is Wonder Woman to me. And I'm so happy to be back here
Hmm.
and to be going to college and to have walked my father through the winter of his life and to have the opportunity to help mom as we navigate this next step.
Yeah.
And our relationship is much better now than it was growing up. And I see her much more as a human, than a mother as I get older. There is no way we can proactively communicate and have the conversation about my childhood and have it go well.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
no way.
Yeah.
And I know that.
Too many feelings, too many personalizations, too many, yeah.
Right. Too
Yeah.
many ways to take it way too personally.
Hmm.
That would be a terrifying conversation. When that happened, I was like, oh no. No, 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 no. I had to pause and
Yeah.
like sit there for a minute and decompress and then watch it because I knew I was getting like I'm adding my own personal shit to this and I don't need to be.
Hmm. 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 Yeah. That's how I get kind of when Christopher gets involved. I
Oh,
I have to kind of like I just have to kind of like mentally step back for a second and just be like, okay, because
no,
it,
any interaction between him and and Luke, like I just hyperventilate,
yeah,
hyperventilate.
yeah, because it's like that's where I think I can relate to Rory the most, but then also can't relate at all because Christopher wasn't a good dad and he wasn't there, but at least, and I say least in the most literal sense that I can say least. Like when I say
Right, like
bare
the bar is in
minimum,
hell.
the bar is in hell. The bar may not even really exist. The least that I can give him is that he at times wanted to be there. But
Right.
just like Lorelai, he wasn't mature enough, but because he was the father in the situation, he got the chance to leave.
And
And
Lorelai knew that. That's why she said, "Don't be involved. I will do this myself."
I'll
She
do it.
knew he was not going to be a good father.
Exactly. Because she's so headstrong, she was going to make it work. You know, like Lorelai, even though she probably should not be anybody's mama, she was gonna make it work. Christopher, what always breaks my heart is that Lorelai, not Lorelai, well Lorelai too, but Rory knows that he's not going to do what he says he's gonna do, but she hopes against hope, and
Yeah,
I
and you
know that
can see
feeling.
that especially when like Chris and Lorelai are working on getting married.
Yep. Yes. Yes. And you know what always breaks my heart, and I know that it shouldn't, but it's such a small thing, but it's also huge at the same time, is the fact that Gigi's last name is Hayden. That always breaks my heart for Rory because she didn't get a chance to be Lorelai
A
Hayden.
Hayden.
Yeah, she's not a Hayden. She is a Gilmore. And we hear her refer to herself as a Gilmore. Her grandparents refer to her as a Gilmore. She is never a Hayden. And the one time really that we see her with her paternal grandparents, it goes horribly.
It
And
does. No, they
I
are
mean,
awful, horrible people.
they were horrible people. But then Gigi is born and she's Georgia Hayden, and it just always just breaks my heart for her because it's like,
Especially because she's what, 20
yeah.
maybe. If that had happened to me, I would be heartbroken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what
Because what do you mean they love her and they treated me like that?
yep, exactly. Exactly. It would just like my heart, that's where my heart chatters for Rory is that whole situation, and just Lorelai thinking about how, and it's so sad that that's actually what brings Lorelai into thinking about how she gave birth to Rory and how different things were, and how she was alone and then she had to leave and be by herself even more. She had no help from him, and now he's so involved and he just loves this little girl, and
And he's
she
a grade A dad,
grade A because he's ready now. Even if he's not fully ready, he's ready to take on the role. And it's just that's where like I have to kind of like I'll start crying if I think about it because that is
It's
just
just
such
so
a deep
sad.
thing. And then,
And
oh, sorry.
no, you're all good. I was just about to say, like, as a woman
Yeah.
and thinking about motherhood and the fear of walking into that alone because birth is traumatizing.
hmm
It just is that you don't go through something like that and come out the same person.
Right.
And she did that all alone
And the fact that she chose to do it alone, that was like the
because she
fact,
didn't feel safe with anyone in that room.
yes, that is frightening to think that she was 16 and she would rather give birth by herself than have her parents there.
Mm-hmm.
It's
And
just,
like,
oof.
oh, it just breaks my heart, especially because like I want to be a nurse and I'm going in, to college to be a nurse. And while I don't want to do labor and delivery for
Mhm.
my own personal reasons,
Yeah,
um, I can deal with, tragedy with adults.
yeah,
Tragedy with children just hits different. I can't do it. Um, there is a special place for people who can. Um, as a nurse, the way I would have just loved on that little girl because that was a little girl giving birth.
absolutely, absolutely, it absolutely.
Oh,
And Chelsea, is it Chelsea Goings that played her from All That? Was because she was the lady, she was the girl from All That. I remember that. And I want to say her name was Chelsea Goins or Chelsea Cummins. It was one of the two. She was going
it
or
was one
coming.
of those. Yeah, I know
It was
who
one of
you're
the two of
talking
them.
about. I see a face, but I can't remember the name.
It was Chelsea. The only reason I remember her name is because she was on the All That, like All That when they tried to redo it in like '04, somewhere in there. That's the only reason I remember.
Yeah,
But or two, it was like '02, '04, something like that. But either way, I remember that, and I always remember thinking she was the perfect young Lorelai. Like if there
she
was ever
was.
an actress who could play Lorelai as a young person, it was her. She was
Oh yeah.
perfect. When she was like, I'm coming in, I'm taking my shoes off, I'm leaving my backpack on the thing. Like, I just always remember that. And I remember thinking that is such a Lorelai thing to do. It's just,
Right.
and
Like
it
if
just be
you're
so
here,
funny.
announce it now.
And just trying to also get a rise out of them if they are there and like get
Yes.
yelled at, whatever. And it's like, even when you start to, A Year in Life does kind of do this too, when you really start to kind of listen to the person that Lorelai was and you hear about her being a little, she enjoyed herself when she was younger.
She was a
um
wild child.
she was a wild child, and you hear that and it's like I don't know what to do with that sometimes because it's it's not like I have this picture of just like pious chastity with Lorelai, but it's almost like I always had imagined that Chris was her first or something like that maybe.
I can
But
see that. And you
yeah,
know what it comes down to?
what?
She's the quirky neurodivergent girl.
Mm,
And quirky neurodivergent girl is funny. She's quirky, she's sassy, right? She has all these fun attributes, but people don't like to think about people on the spectrum
mhm.
doing spicy things.
See, I hadn't thought about it like that. I think it was because they never really told us. That was always what I
That too.
assumed it was. They had never really told us that Lorelai, was kind of on the wilder side a little bit. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but I think it also fleshes out that she was looking for acceptance from somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. And that's kind of like I had a wild child phase in my life. I had fun. We'll put it
hmm
that way.
hmm
And I did some things that had I been caught for, I'd probably still be in jail for. Um,
Jill, wait,
uh,
not
we
just
we
stole the
we
boat. Not just
oh
stole the boat.
we no, but I'll talk about that. And people go, you're so put together.
hmm
You're so this, you're so that. You are, responsible because to now I am.
hmm
And it gives very much similar to like Lorelai vibes. I won't say I'm cool like Lorelai, but like I have a lot of similar attributes. And people look at that and go, no, you couldn't do any of that. You're too sweet.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's like, well, you see, what happened was.
You're our sweet precious angel baby. I could see that though. I have to break myself from doing that because like you and Mia and Nix, I just could not imagine because I think it's also
All
because
the sweet, all the kind,
yeah.
all of the, good
Mhm.
came from experience.
It's a
We'll
choice.
put it that way.
It's a choice at this point. It's like but I also think too that's because my view of the world is so um limited. I don't know what word to use there, but I'll just
Isolated, maybe?
yes, yes. And so like I do think we kind of always have the idea of someone who is like this, they act this way. And when we think you have to be like wild and loud to have lived any kind of life or to be living a life. And so it's like I like that and bringing it kind of back to Gilmore Girls, I kind of like that they didn't tell us that about Lorelai because I think that
Hmm.
added to that irresponsible. I'm very hesitant to use the word that was about to come out of my mouth because think I don't know why I was gonna say that, but I think that I was gonna say that kind of from Emily's standpoint. I was gonna say
How she
unworthy.
sees her daughter.
Yes, I was gonna use the word unworthy. And
Ooh.
and that's why I had to stop myself because I was like, wait, why was I gonna say that? And then I thought about it, and I think I think that that would have been how Emily sees her is like
Yep.
if we know about those partying ways or the fact that she would enjoy herself, that it could almost validate Emily and make it be like, oh well, that's why Emily was so protective, or that's why Emily did X, Y, and Z. um
Hmm.
because even when Emily gets mad at her, it's like, okay, well now Lorelai is like almost 50. And so we're so far away from that it's like, oh girl, you were just young. Where with Lorelai being so young at the beginning of the show, it would have kind of added into like, oh well, that's how she got here.
Yeah.
To having a child, that having this 16-year-old and she's only 32. So it's like I'm kind of glad they didn't because that would have I think been a I don't think that would have gone over too well.
I think it would have led to a lot of misunderstanding, and that comes from personal experience
Hmm.
because, I did have that wild child, phase in my life, and so my
Hmm.
family treats me as such, even though, I'm pushing 30, I'm in college, I'm getting a degree. And am I hitting it a little later than some? Absolutely. But I'm very different from the girl, that existed then, that was hurting and trying to find that group that accepted her and falling into, I wouldn't say falling into, I very willingly participated in some very under the table activities.
Yeah, yeah.
But I was also, 12 to 16 without a fully developed frontal lobe, very neurodiverse, and being taken advantage of in more ways than one.
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, it's the truth of the matter, and it happens to a lot of us. It happens to a lot of people, and it's an experience, and you take it and you move forward.
Hmm.
And it's the same thing with Lorelai.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. With the stage of life, I mean, and first off, I want to congratulate you. I do want to say that I want to take a moment and really say that you're not ever too old to start something, and I'm glad that you realize that because definitely, and I know we're not. I am. I'm just gonna say I'm talking about Gilmore Girls, but I'm kind of not. I'm talking to you. But I think a lot of times we do hear like, "Oh, you're this age, you can't do this." Oh, you're this age. Why are you just now going to school? Or why are you da 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 da? Why are you chasing a dream now? You should have been doing that. And it's like I don't think that people quite understand that sometimes you're not ready to do something
Oh,
until you're ready to
absolutely.
do it. And they think that you should just be able to because you're 22, get out there and X, Y, and Z. So I'm very proud of you for doing
Oh,
things
thank
your
you.
time. So we just got a little off topic there. I had a little venting session. But I do want to say that I think that's the beauty of a show like Gilmore Girls, not just this specific show, but sort of being able to talk about these shows that we love is that it does give you a space to where you relate so much to the characters in whatever way you relate to them that you do feel comfortable and you just start kind of going into your own life.
Hmm.
And
No,
yeah,
and they did such a good job of connecting people. Like you were just talking about to the point that when Richard dies,
yes.
everybody's bawling.
Mm-hmm.
I felt and like funnily enough, the rewatch I was doing that fell right in time to guess where.
Where?
September with my dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I start bawling for all new reasons, but it was my like I hadn't cried about it
Mm-hmm.
until then. It gave me the opportunity to release, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I needed that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know, it felt like I lost my dad all over again, but
Mhm.
in a necessary way.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of the beauty of TV, I think, is that I think sometimes when we're going through a lot of pain, we don't want ourselves to feel it. We don't want ourselves and to really give into it. And so you can kind of convince yourself in the moment, I'm crying with Lorelai. I'm crying with Emily. I'm crying with Rory. I'm crying with these people. And
Hmm.
but like you said, you're allowing yourself to feel what you feel, but you can kind of do it through that lens.
And it was a safe place to do it. And I love that show for that reason because especially among girls and women and children, sometimes growing up as adolescents, especially now, it feels like you can't be vulnerable.
Yes, I can imagine. I can absolutely, because even though I can't relate, clearly, um,
You probably can to a certain extent. Like I
yeah,
said, with adolescence and that ability to like that, and especially as a social media, you
mm,
know, uh, professional. I'll say it that way because you are a professional, really. Um, there's that space you have to have with the world.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
And then it feels like there's not really a lot of places you can turn to talk about the things you really need to talk about. Shows like this gave you an outlet.
absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's why we still talk about them. Because I don't know if you know this about me, but I love shows with family dynamics. Those tend to be the shows that I gravitate towards, and so I was always obsessed with Emily, Emily
Imola, I mean,
Lorelai.
in a way.
Emily Gilmore. Um, I was always obsessed with her and Lorelai, and then just because of how tense it would be when they were in a room together, and like when you see Trix and I could always imagine that Trix probably spoiled Lorelai the way that Emily spoils
Oh,
Rory.
absolutely. I always got the biggest kick out of Trix.
I loved her so much. God, I loved her. I loved her so much.
The fear that Emily had of this woman.
As soon as she would hear, I mean, as soon as she would hear that Trix was coming into town, Emily's whole face would just drop, and Lorelai looked like she would be so ready for the mess. It's it's almost like Emily just can't escape a Lorelai. There, every time she turns around, there's a Lorelai somewhere.
Oh my gosh, yes. And like the funniest thing about it, there's a little vindictive side of me that says, okay, Emily gets to have her taste.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
let's watch this. I'm here for it. And then I have to take that step back and be like, okay, Emily's a human too. Calm down.
Well, that it makes me wonder almost if, and I don't know how to say this, and I don't know how to phrase it because we never got anything that gave us any indication that this could be true. So please take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. It
Hmm.
almost makes me wonder if Emily was
Lashing out.
almost not just lashing out, but in her own kind of like demented way, trying to quote unquote maybe like protect Lorelai because
I could
she
see it.
hated Trix and kind of saw her as the enemy, and she didn't want Lorelai to be like Trix like there's something there. And the reason that I always feel like there's something there is because Lorelai does that with Rory. She tries to
Yeah,
keep her from that world, and she tries to keep her from that, the money and the lifestyle and the way that like they go do
absolutely.
debutante balls and all this and that and the coming out parties and whatever else. And so I almost wonder if Emily thought that maybe Trix was too lax or she was too sarcastic or she was too whatever. And she was trying to like protect her from that and be like, you should be a proper young lady so that you can avoid this.
Right. In this lifestyle. And it
Hmm.
makes me wonder if they'd explored the Trick storyline more, if we would have seen that. Because you see bits and pieces of it,
Hmm.
right? When she comes in. But they kind of, I feel like the Trick storyline kind of waned out almost as soon as it started.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I can see why, because it kind of deviated from like the rest of the show and its kind of core values. But it was an interesting look into why Emily is the way she is.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier that Emily was probably too young to be a mom. She wasn't fully prepped or ready, like in her head to be that. And it made me think about like the standard for women of that time. Because
Hmm.
Emily, I've always kind of seen as being around the same age as my mother.
Yeah.
Because my mother was older when she had kids for
Hmm.
certain, but they always kind of seemed to hold a lot of those same values, right?
Hmm.
Um, And at that point in time, especially for wealthy women, and my mom defied the norm on this in many ways, is that you got married, you had kids,
Yeah.
you raised the home.
Yeah.
That was your life. That was your option.
Yeah.
And you could go to work. You had the right to, for certain,
Hmm.
after a certain extent, much later. But at the point where that right came into play, you were either too old to try,
Yeah.
or if you did, it was frowned
Hmm.
depending on the environment you're in. And for Emily, it's that second option.
Yeah.
And we can look at Emily and know that image matters.
Yes.
Like the whole reason she went to college was to find Richard.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
And
that
then
was a standard for women of that time in that like demographic.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because when you
You
look at
wanted to be
somebody like Trick,
educated,
mm-hmm. Sorry.
but being educated was just a plus of being a wife.
Exactly. It just meant that your husband could say, "Oh, I met my wife at this college. We went here." That's what that meant, like it was
Yeah,
added prestige.
exactly. Of like, I'm educated and I chose my life, and
Hmm.
I chose to be a wife. I chose to be a mother. And
Hmm.
that's noble, right? And it is to a certain extent. But I wonder if Emily watching Lorelai do everything out of order and still succeed on a large scale with a lot of hard work and a lot
Yes.
of this intelligence, if she saw a missed opportunity and she
And
didn't
have people
resent some of
rally
that.
around her. I think that's the other big part of it too, having this
She had
entire
that
thing
community
around.
behind her to say,
Mhm.
yes, you can do this. And Emily never had that for that option of her life.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
Emily was so smart
Yes.
and
Absolutely.
so witty and so capable.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you had put her in Richard's situation and gave her the same opportunities, she'd probably have done better than Richard.
Well, and you know what? You know what that makes me think about is the fact that Trix seemed fairly independent. Like, even
Oh,
though,
yeah.
like clearly it was her family name and money and prestige and whatever, but she was wielding it, especially as the matriarch. You could tell there was a level of like, girl, I did my stuff. I'm good.
Yeah.
Like,
And do you know why Trix had that opportunity?
mhm.
She was widowed early.
Exactly.
So
E-
she got the opportunity to try.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the perk of if you were widowed early. And I don't say that like, oh, you don't miss your husband. Trix probably loved her husband.
Her cousin husband.
Her cousin, oh, I forgot about that. Oh my God, yes. But that was how it was done then, you know?
It is.
And that was her norm. As gross as it was her norm,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Um, she had the opportunity to become the independent woman and enjoy the perks of an independent life,
Mm-hmm.
and then turned to a woman who never had that opportunity and said, well, why didn't you do that?
Yes. Exactly.
And
Exactly.
that's why I have a little bit of venom for Trix, as well as loving when she comes on screen.
Because see, and that also does make me think too, though. Um, how much influence did Trick have in her life? Because in Lorelai's life, because it almost makes me think Trix may have been trying to teach Lorelai how to be independent and how to, build her own life and be herself. Then you have Emily, who, like you said, is raised in a world where that's not her norm. That's not who she was. And in her mind, a young lady is supposed to find a husband. She's supposed to get married. She's supposed to do those things. And I feel like Trix was probably like, oh, okay. I mean, hey, girl, you had that baby. Look at you. It's very that.
Yeah, and Trix has, I think, has a lot more empathy for
Hmm.
Emily, or not Emily, for Lorelai. I'm mixing up names here. Because if we have to remember, Trix was also a single mother. She had a lot more money and a lot more ability to have help,
Hmm.
but she was
Hmm.
also a single mother.